Okay, so this tutorial is looking at the particle features in 3D Studio Max. And in particular, we're going to dive into making sort of a water feature for the front of a building, maybe a waterfall. And you'll see pretty easily how you could turn it into an upward trajectory to create any different kind of water effect, fountains, things like that. Calling this a waterfall would probably be an exaggeration, but the idea is that we want to get something that begins to emulate water. This is by no means going to be perfect, but it's definitely going to give us something that conveys a sense of motion in water as a feature in our design. So the first thing I want to make sure that everybody does that's going to follow along with this tutorial is to buzz to unit setup and make sure that you're not working in arbitrary numbers, but that you're actually working in US standard feet with fractional inches, because scale certainly matters with some of the steps that we're going to do. What we're going to be using is under the Create tab, Geometry and Particle Systems, and we're going to use a tool called P-Array. P-Array is particularly nice because it allows the selection of any object as an emitter source. So again, I'm putting this icon in place. It's only a placeholder. It's actually not going to be doing anything specifically. It does not render out, but it holds the data and is the visual representation in the scene of the data that makes the particle system work. So what I'm going to do is I want the particles to be emitted from a plane, sort of as if water is moving down a channel, something like that I'm going to build. So I'm going to go back to Create, Standard Primitives, and I'm going to build a plane. And I want that plane to be about 3 feet by 1 foot. Not 11 feet, 1 foot. There we go. And I'm going to stand that up on end to get something just like that. Okay, so I'm going to select my P-Array source. I'm going to go to the Modify, and I'm going to select that plane as my emitter. Once I have that, I can actually even start to see the first particle being emitted from the plane. I'm just going to go ahead and hit play, and we can begin to see particles coming out of the plane. Now, if you notice, they are coming out over the entire surface. I can switch that to any other particular part that I want for this tutorial along over entire surface is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and extend the timeline right here across the bottom by going to Time Configuration. I'm going to set my end time to 400. Say OK. And what I want to do next is go ahead and look at the core options inside of the particle array past the object. So the icon size that's currently set to 1 foot right now, we're okay with that. In the viewport, I actually want to switch this to display a mesh. Right now that's made all the ticks disappear. That's because the little tick marks that were there, turn those back on, are only placeholders. Those essentially hold the place of what mesh is going to be applied. So I can either select an object and apply that to the ticks. And in fact, let's just do that really quick. So if I have a box right here, about that size, I can go back to select my P-Array, and I can say particle type, instance geometry, and then I'm going to pick my box object like that. Now if I come back and say my particle types, what I want to see is actually the mesh. I'll actually see the boxes that I selected as my particles. Okay, so that's particularly handy when I want to do something like, let's say, birds or another object that's going to move. I can actually animate this, apply that as my instance geometry, and then the particle system is going to drive it. So that's a great feature, but that's not really what I want to use for this particular project. For this project, I'm going to use metaparticles. And metaparticles are little blobby looking guys. Let's see if I can actually see some of them. And you can't see any of them yet in the scene, but we'll get there. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that guy. So let's look first at the particle generation. So right now I'm only seeing 10% of the particles on screen. We'll change that and raise that up in a little bit. I'm going to set my use rate to 20. That's essentially going to double the amount of particles that are coming out of my plane. I'm going to set my particle size to about 6 inches. And immediately you can start to see a little bit more happening with the particles. Previously they were too small. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my speed down to 1 inch. And that's essentially going to slow everything down significantly as it's coming out. But you notice the next thing is the particles are disappearing really quickly. And that has to do with this set of numbers right here. So the particles are stopping emission at frame 30. So if I scroll the shuttle past frame 30, you'll notice that after 30 there are no more particles leaving the plane. The next thing is they're only displaying until frame 100. So if I scrub to 100, well, actually they're gone away even before frame 100 because each particle only has 30 frame lifespan. They stop emitting at frame 30. So at frame 60 is when the last particle should start to disappear, right around here. So I need to change all of those. I want particles to emit through frame 300. And I want them to have let's go ahead and set this to a 100 frame lifespan. Kind of look at the difference. You know, they're probably still not hanging around long enough. Let's go ahead and change that lifespan to about 400 so that they're hanging on throughout the entire animation. Oh, and then I need to go ahead and say I want particles to display all the way through frame 400. So if you notice, one of the things that does happen is as I'm moving the shuttle forward in time, I have more and more particles on screen. And that becomes a problem because I'm basically continually increasing the geometry the longer the animation goes on. So that is something that I'm going to be very, very careful with as the project moves forward to make sure that I'm keeping things in check. I'll come back and edit these at some point in time, often on these projects that are using particles, to make sure I'm not having too many things on screen at any given moment. The next thing that I want to change is the metaparticles have this idea of growing and fading away, which is interesting, but exactly not what water would do. So I'm going to change my grow 4 to 0, my fade 4 to 0 as well. And that way they're starting at the size that I want them to be. The last thing I'm going to do here in terms of looking at sort of the pre-render quality is I'm going to go ahead and raise my particle display up to 100%. So right here underneath viewport display, I'm only seeing 10% of the particles. I'm going to raise that up to 100%. So I can begin to look at the quality of what's happening with the mesh. And I can see that looks exactly like water doesn't. So I've got to come in and make a few more modifications so that this actually begins to read more as sort of water that is roiling just a little bit, but isn't doing something ridiculous like this. So I'm going to come back in, and I'm going to change the divergence from 10% to 0. That's essentially saying I don't want them to spread out. I want them to go ahead and stay fairly simple. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my speed variation to 50%. That's going to move things a little bit faster and a little bit slower so that particles sort of don't happen in marching rows. You'll definitely see that if you don't set your variation to vary the speed of the particles. The last thing I'm going to do is underneath the meta particle properties, I need to go ahead and modify my tension. If I raise the tension up, let's just change it to 5, you'll notice that there is sort of less of a grip between the objects that get smoothed out. So each particle is sort of this individual little blob. If I lower the tension, there they have more smoothing throughout the process. And I actually want something that is smoothed out a bit. So I'm going to use that particular tool. To do that, I'm going to give that a little bit of a variance as well, just so there's a little bit of inconsistency throughout it. Okay, so I'm getting pretty close to what I want in terms of water moving, but the one thing that you'll notice here is that all of these objects are starting to float. So this is more like dangling spray foam than it is water. And I actually want those water systems to sort of sit on a surface and be affected by gravity and then pour over an edge. So to do that, I'm going to come in and I'm going to go to my space warps. And first I'm going to add a system of gravity. So gravity by default is 9.8 meters per second square. So that is what gravity really is on Earth. I'm just going to keep my strength at 1. I don't want any decay. And then what I want to do is I want to bind this force to my particle array system. Now note, I'm not dragging this to my plane object here. That is my particle emitter. I'm dragging it to the P array object like that. And now you notice that all my objects are falling. They're being affected by gravity. So the next thing that I want to do is bring in a deflector. So again, under space warps, I'm going to drop down to deflectors, and I'm just going to use a real basic deflector type. And I'm going to stretch that out underneath this object right here. And then I'm going to make sure I'm moving it so it is just below my plane. And then, if you notice, it's doing absolutely nothing right now. That's because, again, I haven't bound this to my P array. So I'm going to do that. Oh, something didn't take. Let's try that one more time. I'm going to bind my deflector to my array. There we go. And now what I get is really odd. I get bouncy water, which is kind of fun. And it looks like I need to lower the object just a little bit as well. So let's look first at the deflector's property. You notice the bounce is 1. So we actually don't want water to bounce. I'm going to set that to 0.2, and immediately you're going to see, oh, it's flattened out. Looks a lot better. Okay, I still need to drop that deflector down a little bit to make sure it's picking up all of the particles. Almost. Looks like that should do it. So now what I'm getting is water that is moving over the edge and then beginning to cascade off. Something like that. Now I'm still not quite happy with the density of that. If you notice, as the water is moving to the edge, I'm getting these little balls that drop off, which isn't too cool. It's not really what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to increase the number of particles in the P array. So in my modifier list, if you notice, gravity and the deflector are both in the modifier list for this P array object. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to drop down to my initial values here, which are use rate. I'm going to go ahead and double that to 40. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set my display back down to 10%. Simply so that I can preview things quite a bit faster. You can see that. And then let's see if I'm actually getting sort of that pouring effect that I'm looking for. Let's come back up here and we'll change that to 100%. And you can see, you know, they're still kind of marching along in a row, which I'm not too wild about. So I believe what I'm going to need to do is make a few additional modifications. So I'm going to give my particle size some variation, pretty dramatic variation. I'm going to change that to 50%. I'm going to give the variation on the life span of the particles about 20%. I'm going to change the time span on the particles to about 200 frames. And essentially, you know, if I zoom way out on this, you'll notice that they start to die off at some point. You know, I don't need them to cascade that far down. In fact, we can go ahead and drop that maybe even to 100 frames. So essentially, each particle has a lifespan of about 3 seconds. And to be able to navigate around, I'm going to drop my particles back to 10% again. So I'm still not quite happy with sort of this rowing of the particles that's on here. So I'm going to look at one other variance, and that's the speed. I'm going to add a little bit of divergence. Let's do a little bit more divergence than that. Too much. That's a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and change my speed to 2 inches. And you can see I'm getting more alignment, or less alignment, I should say, with the particles. And then I'm going to increase my speed variation. Let's go ahead and raise that all the way up to 75%. And so I'm getting something that's a little more fluid. I'm going to drop my divergence back down to 2 as well. So essentially I'm working those numbers until I'm getting the effect that I'm really wanting to see in terms of how this water cascades over the top. I'd still like to see it connect just a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to my tension, and I'm going to drop that even further to about 0.15. And my variation down to 10%. And it looks like I need to increase the particle size as well to continue to get those to sort of connect together. And that particle size, let's see here. It's up here at the top. Let's raise that to 8 inches. Then I'm going to drop this back down. So that's much closer to what I'm looking for. I'm going to drop that back down to 10% so that I can navigate quickly through the scene. And you can see I'm getting that kind of effect now. So the last couple of things that I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and apply a basic material. So I'm just going to go with Autodesk Water, and I'm just going to apply the default swimming pool water. Again, I'm not looking for sort of this roiling thing. I'm looking for something that's going to render out looking water-like. Let's go ahead and use that. I'm going to close this, navigate in, rendering, render setup. Just want to do a low quality rendering so it doesn't take too long. And then the last couple of steps that I'm going to do once I can see this initial rendering, once I'm sort of verifying that everything is looking generally okay, is if you notice it's not rendering out the deflector object itself. That's just a placeholder. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a box. Create objects, box. I'm just going to kind of get that working about in the same location that the deflector is. But I'm actually going to move it up from the height of the deflector so that, I don't want to see the underside of the geometry here. I want that to cut off the particles about like that. I'm going to slide it back even just a little bit to get that kind of effect. So I'm going to go back to my material editor. I'm just going to drop a matte paint on that. Just a standard matte finish. I'm not looking for any reflections or anything like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and go create lights, daylight system, to get a little bit of nice lighting quality with this. And then we'll create one more rendering. Oh, last thing, actually, before creating one more rendering, I'm going to go ahead and select my emitter object, and I'm going to say hide selection. That way it doesn't actually render out that object. So the final result, again, isn't going to give me something that is super realistic, but it should give me something that really begins to get the effect of water moving. By adding additional deflectors, you can definitely increase the complexity of what the water is doing, how it looks, how it works. You could use a different particle type. Like if I was under the Create tab and Particle Systems, I could use the Super Spray or Spray to begin creating more of a fountain effect where particles go up in the air. I can use a P cloud to actually start doing flocking with birds, leaves, things like that as well. So that's the introduction to particle systems.